everybody. Welcome back to Geezer Bob's Book Club. Bob is our book editor over here at the Geezer Club, and he's just read. I started to say he read a new book, but no, Bob just finished reading an old book that he wants to tell us about. John Fogerty's memoir, which is titled "Fortunate Son: My Life, My Music." This was published in October 2016. And we've been going on a roundtable. We've been doing a series of on the Creedence Clearwater discography. We're moving through that. And Bob had never read this book before, so he decided that while we're in the middle of doing some Creedence discussion, he went ahead and picked up this book and read it. And even though it's 5 years old, he and I talked about it, thought, well, maybe there's a few of our viewers out there who would still like to hear about this thing, because it's, you know, it's still available in paper book and electronic and audiobook and all that. So it's still out there. It's only been 6 years, 5.5 years or something like that. So we thought you might still be interested in hearing about it. So take it away, book editor Bob.
All right. Thank you, Scotty. As Scott said, this book came out in 2016, and I'm not certain how I missed it the first time around, because I like biographies, especially, you know, when I read about creative people who've done things that I like. So anyway, this is a book. It's called Fortunate Son, and I got into it because we're doing this series about the Creedence discography, and I thought it might help give me some insight into their music. And it does do that, but ultimately, this is a book about redemption. It's the life story of a person who reached the pinnacle at a young age, who pretty much had everything taken away from him, who plunged down into the black depths of despair for a very long time, and then found redemption in the latter part of his life, found happiness, found love, and found success again. So there are several ways you can approach this book. That redemption story is one of them. The other part is learning about John Fogerty's influences, his life, why and how he created his music. And then there's a third part of it, which is if you're interested in all of the legal entanglements that Fogerty got involved in, that's another section to this book. Anyway, John recounts growing up in small town California, and actually gives a little bit of an explanation about how a California boy becomes enamored with the South like he has. And part of that came at an early age when his mom introduced him to the music of the 1800s composer Stephen Foster, who wrote all of those songs, you know, about the South. And it kind of captivated Fogerty's imagination. And he learned that Stephen Foster was not a Southerner. Stephen Foster was a Northerner, I believe, from Philadelphia. So, Fogerty kind of imitates Foster. He wrote all these songs about the South, even though he never lived in the South and had never been there. Fogerty relates his development as a teenage musician, the founding of several of his bands, Creedence. He talks about the influences from some of the songs that he wrote, how he carried a little notebook with him, and any time that a phrase would pop into his head, he would just write it down, even though it may not have meant anything at the time. And then that would be something that he might draw on later. Like he wrote down the words "Proud Mary" without having any idea what they might mean later. And then, of course, that became, one of his more famous songs down the road. Fogerty was very, very critical in the book of his bandmates in Creedence. I think maybe a little unfairly so, but he was very critical about their abilities, basically said they didn't bring much to the table. He had to spoon feed, what they played and everything. I think that was maybe a little unfair, but Fogerty was very negatively influenced by the things that happened to his career. And if you don't know the story, it's very involved. And I'm not going to go into great detail, but I'll try to be as brief as I can about it. They signed with Fantasy Records. and Fogerty lost the rights to all of his music. Their proceeds from all of those albums they sold disappeared. They got put into Cayman Islands Bank that their accountant said, yeah, do this, and all of the money disappeared because the bank folded. There were all kinds of lawsuits over that. When Creedence broke up, Fogerty still owed Fantasy 80 or 90 songs. And he finally, and it took him years and decades, in fact, to finally recover from all of that. And there were bitter lawsuits all over the place and horrible antagonism between Fogerty and the band members, because they wound up kind of backing Fantasy and Saul Zaentz, and including Fogerty's brother Tom. So he goes into great detail about all of those legal battles, and Fogerty has a distinction of being actually being sued for plagiarizing himself, because he did a comeback album called Center Field and had a song, The Old Man Down the Road. And Saul Zaentz and Fantasy Records sued Fogerty, saying that he had plagiarized an earlier song called Run Through the Jungle that Fantasy had the rights to. So Fogerty actually had to go, and he details going into court, having to defend himself about that, and taking his guitar into a courtroom and playing The Old Man Down the Road and Run Through the Jungle, and showing how they were different and stuff. And Fogerty eventually won that legal battle, but at the end of it, the judge declined to order Fantasy to pay his legal bills, which totaled almost $1 million. So Fogerty had to go all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court to get a ruling forcing Fantasy to finally pay up on the legal fees. After Creedence's breakup, Fogerty was so embittered about everything that happened that he basically quit producing anything. His first album was a covers album called the Blue Ridge Rangers, where he played every instrument on the album. It wasn't until he came out with an album of more original material that had some success to it, and he was actually able to start kind of writing some more songs. He delivered another album called Hoodoo in 1976 that was so horrible that he destroyed the tapes and did not do anything else again until 1984. So he had an 8-year window where there was no songwriting, nothing. And he's struggling with serious drinking problems and emotional issues, refused to play any Creedence material. And he had a comeback album called Center Field. And that was a great album, and he found success again. His follow-up album to that, Eye of the Zombie, was terrible and tanked. So again, he spirals back down, doesn't do anything. Finally, his first marriage failed, and he eventually met his second wife, Julie. They had a long involved relationship, finally got married. She became the love of his life. And she actually writes part of the book where she details, their meeting and their romance and everything. And so this now begins the redemption part. He finds a stable marriage, the love of his life. He's able to start writing again and has another big comeback album called Blue Moon Swamp. But it took him 5 years in the studio to get that album done, and still struggling with being able to write again, struggling with the drinking and all sorts of things. But ultimately, John Fogerty found a happy place again in life, in somewhere in his 40s, and starts turning, his life around. He's happy again. It's a fascinating book because he does give you a glimpse into his creative process. He tells you about his musical heroes, the people that he loved, especially instrumental artists. He had a great love of instrumentalists. Booker T and the MGs, Dwayne Eddy, a lot of those kind of people. He talks a lot about his work ethic. He dishes pretty big on bands like the Grateful Dead, calling them sloppy and lazy and a lot of things like that. It's a fascinating study about all of the legal entanglements that Fogerty got into and just how mean and nasty the music business can be. This is Fogerty's side, so I take part of it with a grain of salt. but I do want to give some credence to what he says, no pun intended, because he details a part of his legal battle with Saul Zaentz, who was, president of Fantasy Records. And on one of his albums, Fogerty did a song called Zaentz Can't Dance. And it was an attack on Saul Zaentz. And it has a line, Zaentz can't dance, but he'll steal your money. Well, Saul Zaentz sued him over that song. And that was part of the legal battle. And Fogerty was trying also to get the rights to his music back. So he enlists the aid of concert promoter Bill Graham, who comes to Fogerty's aid. And Bill Graham and one of Graham's chief officers start negotiating with Saul Zaentz about getting Fogerty's music rights back. And Zaentz says, well, if you'll pay me for damaging my credibility with Zaentz Can't Dance, I will sell your music to you, but I will give you a discount on it because of everything that you did for Fantasy. So Bill Graham says, hey, take the deal. And Fogerty says, I don't trust him. I don't trust him. You can't trust Saul Zaentz. Look, Saul Zaentz has been very honorable in the negotiations. I believe you can trust him. So Fogerty takes Zaentz at his word. He gives him a monetary settlement for the libel. Then Zaentz turns around and says, okay, I want this amount of money for your song rights. And it was probably double what the stuff was worth. And Fogerty says in his book that normally if you sell publishing rights, it's 10 times what annual income would be. Well, Zaentz wanted 20 times. And the price was so high that nobody would finance Fogerty being able to buy it. So he says, that Bill Graham and Bill Graham's chief officer came back and said, sorry, man, we thought we could trust him. So that kind of lends some backup to Fogerty's claims about, the financial and legal dealings with Saul Zaentz and Fantasy and some of the other things. So yeah, it's a fascinating book. It's interesting on many different levels. And if you're interested in Creedence music, if you're interested in good redemption stories, and if you're interested in a behind the scenes look at the music industry, I recommend the book, even though it is, several years old now. So that's my take on Fortunate Son, Scott.
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, well, now I guess we know where John Fogerty got the inspiration to write about and sound like and kind of adopt this identity as somebody from the bayou, from the South, even though he grew up in Northern California.
Yeah, and there's another fascinating section in the book where sometime in the late 90s, he takes a series of pilgrimages to Mississippi and actually goes down and spends like 6 or 7 week-long trips immersing himself in the culture, of the Delta and all of those blues musicians. And so he finally decides he wants to go intimately see the place that he sang about all of these years. And he has this great epiphany. And for many, many, many years, he refused to perform any Creedence songs out of bitterness over what had happened with his music rights and everything. So he seeks out the gravesite of, famous blues musicians and winds up at one of them where he is sitting there at the gravesite, and the musician has had the exact same kind of thing happen to him that happened to Fogerty, lost all the music rights and everything. Robert Johnson, the king of the Delta blues. So anyway, Fogerty is at his gravesite, and there's this huge pecan tree growing there. So Fogerty's got his hand on this pecan tree, and he just gets this epiphany suddenly that says, Robert Johnson, it doesn't matter who actually owns the rights to your music. It's still your music, and everybody knows that it's your music. So after that epiphany, Fogerty now goes back, and on all of his concerts, he started bringing back all of his Creedence material and joyfully performing it on stage again. So yeah, he did seek out, that culture that he learned about. And there are 2 other really cool instances in the book where Fogerty recounts doing Creedence material. And one, he goes to a Taj Mahal concert, and in the concert audience is Bob Dylan and George Harrison. And Taj Mahal invites all 3 of them up on stage. So Dylan does a Dylan song, Harrison does a Harrison song, and they want Fogerty to do one of his songs. And at first he says, no, I don't do that music anymore. So he recounts Bob Dylan leaning over going, John, if you don't do Proud Mary, everybody's going to think Tina Turner wrote that song. So he's like, oh, okay, I'll do the song. And then somewhere like mid-1980s, Fogerty got invited to perform at this concert in Washington, D.C. as a memorial to Vietnam veterans. And he agrees to perform. And this was televised on HBO. And I remember watching this when it was on HBO. And prior to the show, Fogerty decides he's going to do his Creedence music because he feels that it's owed to the vets, because he had heard from so many of them about how his songs meant so much to them, you know, when they served in Vietnam. And Fogerty was a veteran himself. So unbeknownst to anybody, he did the Creedence material. And he recounts in the book how after the concert, one of the vets comes up to him and gives Fogerty his medal that he won from Vietnam and said, I want you to have this because of how much your music meant to me and all of the other people that I served with in Vietnam. And Fogerty says that at different times throughout them, he's brought that medal out and has, you know, had it like on stage and stuff with him. So three great stories about how he got back to performing his original music. So
I'm sure that was a pretty devastating moment for him.
Very much so, yes.
Yeah. Okay, Bob, thanks for that. The title of the book is Fortunate Son, My Life, My Music. It is still available in paperback and in electronic form at your favorite bookstore, whichever bookstore that may be. But thanks, Bob. Thanks. Bob will be back at some point, I'm sure, with another book sometime in the future. We do a lot of album reviews on Fridays. We do a lot of discussions of classic albums on our roundtables on Tuesdays. So check us out. We will talk to you later. So long.